You may think that you live in a peaceful country and nothing threatens you. But when Russia decides that it wants your territory, people, or even history, it starts breaking rules, norms, and finally your borders. Just as it did in Chechnya, Georgia, and now Ukraine. We must stop them until it is too late. Very soon after the collapse of Soviet Union, Russia realized that its successful future is impossible without Ukraine, because Russia always wants to be an empire. And I would like to stress it here. Ukraine can live happily and freely without Russia, and Russia cannot imagine itself without occupying Ukraine. So very soon after the collapse of the USSR, Russian presidents started thinking how to get Ukraine back. In 2010, a pro-Russian president and government came at rule in Ukraine. That was a serious challenge and problem for Ukrainian society, and it happened because of various business, economic influences, gas threats, and media work. Yanukovych was a totally created by Russian government and Russian presidents figure, totally dependent on their decisions. Another important fact is that many important and influential Ukrainian politicians were actually Russian citizens. Imagine the Minister of Defense of Ukraine, the Minister of Internal Affairs of Ukraine, and the head of SBU were all with Russian passports. Yanukovych, together with Medvedev, in 2012 signed the so-called Kharkiv Pact. It was a tragic document that Ukrainian parliament ratified. Taking into account serious protest even inside parliament, it was really difficult. So what is the essence of this Kharkiv Pact? The fact that Russian Navy will stay in Crimea until 2042. 2042. And this decision, together with Russian military people staying in the Crimea, laid the basis for the future annexation of the peninsula. Badly educated, with ill sense of humor, criminal past, and lack of knowledge, basic knowledge about Ukrainian history and language, Yanukovych was totally dependent on Kremlin. And in 2013, the Moscow Tsar demanded Yanukovych to stop Euro integration processes which were active in Ukrainian society. And Yanukovych, despite the desire of Ukrainian people, decided he will not sign the association of Ukraine with the European Union. It was a huge scandal in Ukrainian and international society. Even Chancellor Merkel tried to persuade him, but he said that it's so difficult to work under Russian pressure and with such a big and influential neighbor close to the borders of Ukraine. And it was planned that on the 29th of November in Vilnius he will sign this agreement, but he disagreed. And on the 21st of November, serious protests started all over Ukraine. Because Ukrainian active civil society was always for the movement in the direction of the European Union and common democratic values. Later, this protest grew into the Revolution of Dignity, Maidan, or whatever you call it, but an extremely important political event that once again signified European choice of Ukrainian people. We all know how Russian and pro-Russian regimes are afraid of people and democratic protests. For a couple of weeks, Yanukovych did not know what to do and started following the orders from Moscow directly. We all know that Maidan turned into a tragedy for many Ukrainian families, and we commemorate the Heavenly 100, more than 100 heroes who were killed on Maidan while protesting for the European and democratic choice of Ukraine. The majority of violent actions that took place on Maidan were coordinated by Russian police, FSB and other intelligence services and Putin directly. When the protests grew stronger and stronger, Yanukovych was advised to take Ukrainian national treasury and escape to Russia. Later, from Russia, he wrote a letter to President Putin asking him to bring Russian soldiers, Russian troops to Ukraine and put the country in order. That's why Russian propagandists still use the phrase Ukrainian coup or Ukrainian regime, because they want to depict our national revolution, our desire to become a part of the civilized and democratic world, as a revolt against Russian government and pro-Russian Ukrainian government. This is already an active stage of the hybrid war, Russian hybrid war against Ukraine. Simultaneously with Maidan, Yanukovych escaped to Russia, green people appear in the Crimea. These were well-trained Russian military men without identification marks, who conducted once again special military operation and seized the majority of local authority institutions. Ukrainian military were demoralized, plus we have to remember that Crimea was allowed to be the base for the Russian Navy. That's why there were lots of Russian soldiers already on the peninsula, and they started seizing and hijacking everything that was Ukrainian there. New Ukrainian government, politicians and deputies that were in Kyiv were advised not to use weapons against these green people, not to provoke, not to escalate. Do you recognize these phrases? They are so common when we talk about Russia and international attitude towards this dark empire. They attack, and we are advised not to escalate. I always wonder how a victim can escalate the conflict. It is only the aggressor who does that. So we were advised not to use Ukrainian armed forces and weapons against these green people, and Russians very quickly annexed Crimea. They have conducted the first fake referendum. It was with guns, police standing within voting cabins, and of course it's not a real choice of Crimean people. It was totally fake, and it was prepared with less than 1 month. So approximately in April, like a month and a half, they have already conducted this referendum. So those who doubt, you have to realize that any normal referendum needs a preparation stage. And of course, you cannot imagine police standing with guns when you are voting and making your choice. But Putin demonstrated it as a free will of Ukrainian people and annexed Crimea. And the world decided not to escalate. It is a tragedy living close to Russia. And simultaneously with Crimea operation, another operation started in big cities of Ukrainian south and east. This operation was called by Putin's regime Novorossiya. And they were trying to proclaim artificial separatist quasi-republics in large regional centers. We had more time, and patriotic Ukrainian powers, together with patriotic police, reacted quickly, and they managed to stop this movement in the majority of Ukrainian cities, like Kharkiv, Dnipro, Mykolaiv, Zaporizhia, but they managed to succeed in Donbas. Russian-funded separatists, together with professional Russian fighters, started creating quasi-republics. But at this moment, Ukrainian government was already operating a little bit stronger, and they declared the anti-terroristic operation. Once again, it was not called real war, not to provoke the world, not to escalate. It goes without saying that acting so quickly, Russia planned this scenario beforehand. They had people, they had ideas, they had money to try and finance various separatist movements inside Ukraine, and then planning to join them to Russia. And Ukrainian armed forces were not that strong as they are now, and I have to explain why. Well, first of all, we were a part of the Soviet Union for a really long period of time. And after its collapse, Russia worked hard to demilitarize Ukraine, to make us sign Budapest Memorandum, for example. And in the result, we had a really poor, badly equipped Ukrainian army. And many people who were at rule inside the Ukrainian armed forces were actually officers and generals prepared by Soviet army. So they were Soviet-minded people who were trained to fight the rotting West, but not Russia. They did not expect such scenario is possible, and as a result, there were lots of traitors, collaborators, and people who were not ready to fight back. One of the most important phenomena of modern Ukrainian history is our volunteer movement. When army was not ready to protect Ukrainian borders, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian patriots, participants of Euromaidan, people who see Ukraine in Europe, joined volunteer military battalions that were ready to protect Ukrainian borders against Russian troops. Many of them traveled to the eastern and southern part of Ukraine to fight against Russians and Russia-funded separatists. And they were really successful. By the end of August, the majority of Donbas territory was free from Russians. But then Putin decides to send ordinary, regular Russian soldiers, well-trained Russian soldiers, to occupy these territories. Actually, this is the moment of an open war, Russian war against Ukraine, but once again, all of us decided not to escalate. Instead, we were advised to negotiate. Today, we all know that any agreement signed with Russia is not worth the paper on which it was signed. But then we did not have a choice. Under pressure, with Russian troops shooting Ukrainian volunteers, we had to sign the first preliminary Minsk Agreement with the help of France and Germany. But Russia brutally broke all of its promises. One crime that we will never forgive Russians is the tragedy of Ilovaisk. Ukrainian volunteer battalions were surrounded by Russian troops, and according to Minsk Agreements, they were allowed to leave through the Green Corridor. But as soon as Ukrainian soldiers started moving this Green Corridor, Russian soldiers started shooting them. In the result, 400 dead and thousands of wounded. This is how Russia negotiates and fulfills the norms of any agreement. Approximately at that time, the front lines are fixed and they will remain the same for long years. Despite Minsk Agreements, Russians continue to shell Ukrainian airport in Donetsk, destroying it, and the railway station in Debaltsevo. Under this pressure and with no possibility to shoot back, Ukrainians are advised to sign Minsk II, which actually does not protect us from anything, and the war continues in the east and south of Ukraine. The war named anti-terroristic operation, but still it is a war started by Russia. It is important to understand and remember that for all Ukrainians, this war started in 2014, not in 2022. In 2022, the world saw the true face of Russia. It was difficult to close eyes and to ask us not to escalate because they start shelling our civilian infrastructure, killing children and bombing all Ukrainian cities. But this war lasted for 8 years already, and since 2014 to 2022, we lost more than 5,000 Ukrainian military and 15,000 civilians. Once successful industrial regions turned into poor and miserable quasi-republics. The majority of people left Donbas region and become internal refugees in Ukraine. But Ukrainian presidents, starting from Poroshenko and finishing with Zelensky, believed it was possible to solve this conflict with the help of diplomatic means. Actually, Zelensky won his elections because he promised to talk to Putin and to persuade him to stop shooting. But we see how criminal and violent Russia is in its desire to destroy freedom and independence around its borders. In Ukraine, we have a saying that unpunished evil grows. And that's what we see since 2014. Unpunished Russia continued attacking free and independent Ukraine, and if we don't stop them here, they are ready to continue elsewhere. Since 2014, there is one thing that I don't like, something that I liked previously, and I think it may demonstrate you how life changes, how quickly life can change. When I see flower petals on the floor, they don't remind me of something beautiful or romantic. They remind me of numerous funerals that I witness living close to the central cathedral in my town. Military funerals. My name is Anna, and I'm an ordinary Ukrainian living in extraordinary times. Every day I witness dozens of Russian crimes against independence, freedom and democracy. And you must witness these crimes because the world is in danger as long as Russia acts that way. Please subscribe to follow more updates and know better the face of the enemy.